And likewise, you as mothers, you can always bring the family together and bring all the dissensions and solve the problem because you have exercised the virtue of love. And Hannah showed it all. And that is the reason you find that John MacArthur in his book beautifully says this. He says that Hannah continuously was tormented and she went through anguish because of infertility that she had possessed. But at the same time, she was tormented, it says, by Peninnah's taunts. But then he goes on to say this. But she never entertained the traits of jealousy and hatred. For you see, the absence of love leads to hatred and jealousy. But the presence of love, my friends, there can be no jealousy and there can be no hatred. Although she had no children and the other lady had a lot of children there, nowhere in the Bible do you see Hannah showing any kind of resentment, any kind of anger, any kind of jealousy. But instead you find she is being quiet to herself because she was dealing herself and she is dealing with God and not with human beings. Apostle Paul, writing to the church at Thessalonica, church at Corinth, he comes to the 13th chapter called as the love chapter. And if we begin with verse 4, he begins to enumerate the various qualities of love, what love can accomplish. And if you read those 4 or 5 verses and apply to the life of Hannah, my friends, you find every one of those things were found in the life of Hannah. You begin with the 4th verse, it says, love is slow to anger, and it is full of kindness. It does not boast of itself. It is not easily provoked. It talks less of itself. In fact, it says, it rejoiceth not in iniquities, but rejoiceth in truth. And then he goes on to explain, love beareth all things. Love believeth all things. Love hopeth all things. Love endureth all things. And he ends up this beautiful chapter. In the very last verse he says, and now abideth faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of this is love. And Hannah exercised love. If not for the love that she had, my friends, Elkanah would have walked away from her life. It is because she showed that kind of love towards her husband and later on towards her children and towards people that he came along, that she rubbed shoulders with, that she was able to keep the family together. In spite of the problem that she had in her home, in spite of the burdens she had deep down in her heart, my friends, her family, her marriage was a healthy marriage because she exercised the virtue of love. And God was going to reward her down through the years for her faithfulness, for her love, and for her piety in dealing with her own husband, in dealing with her children later on. And that is the first important lesson that I thought that I would leave with you as mothers. That you continue to love your husband and your family, and more so in a larger sense, the church family at large. Because where love abides, everything else will fall in place. The second important lesson that I can derive from the life of Hannah, my friends, she was not only a woman who loved her family. What I find, kindly turn to 1 Samuel chapter 1, and then we come to verse 10. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 10. And you find here the second quality of Hannah that you and I can emulate in our Christian journey. For we find very clearly, it says, that in the bitterness of her soul, she prayed to the Lord and wept sore. That is what I see in this text. In the bitterness of her soul. My friends, the spiritual passion of Hannah is to be found in the fervency of her prayer life. I want to go back and emphasize the first part of this text. It says, in the bitterness of her soul. My friends, not in the best of times, but in the worst of times, when things looked very dark and gloomy, when she had no children there, when she was pushed against the wall, when she had hit the rock bottom, it is then, what does she say? The text says, in the bitterness of her soul, she prayed to the Lord. A woman of diligent prayer. That is the second quality that I can learn from the life of Hannah. She was a woman who loved her family. And secondly, here in the 10th verse, I see, she was a woman of diligent prayer. Mrs. White, in fact, says in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 636, she says this. The burden that she could not share with no earthly friend, she cast it upon the Lord. And she pleaded very earnestly, Lord, remove this reproof from me. That was the prayer of Hannah. She didn't want to go and share. And so the great thing about Hannah, my friends, is that when I read this text, it tells me that in spite of the burden that she had, she did not waste her time, she did not waste her energy in complaining or in blaming others. Instead, she goes before the Lord and places the burden in Lord's hand, and she pleads her case before the Lord. What a great lesson that I want that all of us can learn in our journey here. Life is a struggle to every one of us. Life is filled with crises and challenges to every one of us. In fact, the other day as I was praying with one individual late in the night, he said, Pastor, for the last 2 years, I've tried my best to be very faithful in my tithes and offerings. I'm very faithful in my family worship, both morning and evening. I'm very faithful in doing what is right. I'm very cautious of what I'm doing there. And I'm trying to avoid walking in the wrong path, trying to follow the Lord's principles. But Pastor, the more I'm trying to come closer to God, more challenges that I've faced. I've never faced life so painful as it is for the last 2 years. I almost repeated what the words that I have here in my sermon with him. Late into the night, I prayed with him and said, the reason why it happens is because the closer you come to God, more jealous Satan becomes. When you are on the Lord's side, you are the enemy of Satan, my friends. But when you're on the Satan's side, you are his friend. There is nothing more that is going to trouble you. Remember, God is not the source of trouble. He is not the source of problems that you and I face in life. Satan is the source of every kind of crisis that we face. He brings in sometimes our own wrong choices, no question about it. But many a times, because we live in a sin-sick world, Satan is the real source of all things that comes on our way which we do not want it. But here you find that there's a great lesson that you can find. The earnest plea that I want to make to you this afternoon or this morning is this. The greater the challenges that you face, the closer you must be on your knees to God, seeking God's intervention, God's counsel, God's wisdom, God's instruction, and God's knowledge, so that you will make the right choices and not allow your faith to be shattered in any way. Because I'm sure every one of us, as you walked into this church this morning, you had your own burdens. You have many challenges that you're facing in your own life. Whatever it is, the Lord knows about it. I want you to be assured about it. There's nothing that is happening today that God is ignorant about. He knows it. And what is more, He wants to solve those problems, but not in your time, but in God's time. But in the meantime, like Hannah, you and I must learn to have a life of diligent prayer. And that is what she does. When her life is being challenged, she turns not to man, but she turns herself to God. She pleads before the Lord and says, Lord, what is that you want me to do? And then she fights with him. She storms the doors of heaven. Greater the challenges, difficulties, problems, false accusations, unfair treatment in your workplace. Whatever that you might face, my friends, don't quit, but pray more. That is my appeal to you. That is a lesson that I can learn from the life of Hannah. She was a woman who loved her family. As such, she was able to keep the family together. Number two, she was a woman of diligent prayer. In the bitterness of her soul, the Bible text tells me here in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 10, that she prayed unto the Lord and wept sore. In tearful eyes, with tears in her eyes, she knelt and she pleaded with the Lord. Remember the time when she went to the temple to worship? And there, kneeling on the steps leading into the temple, out in the open there, at secret, not uttering a word, she cries unto the Lord in silence. And even Eli, the chief priest, mistook her as though she is fully drunk. But in reality, what she was doing was pleading a case before the Lord, crying out to the Lord in public, but in silence. Place does not matter, my friends. Posture does not matter. What really matters is how sincere you are on your knees praying to the Lord. I find that her prayer was very intense. She was very focused, and she was very earnest in pleading her case before the Lord. For I read in 1 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 11. It says here, cry unto the Lord. It says, seek the Lord and seek his strength. And he says, seek him continually. Seek his face continually. That is the counsel that we get from the Bible. In 1 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 11. Seek the Lord and his strength, and seek his face continually. I also read in Isaiah chapter 58, verse 9, Prophet Isaiah, the messianic prophet, he writes and says, thou shalt call, and the Lord shall hear. Thou shalt cry, and the Lord shall say, here I am. What other promise can you depend upon? What other promise can you ask for? The Lord says here, thou shalt cry, and the Lord shall say, here I am. What a comforting promise for all of us to grasp onto.